In a quiet Boston neighborhood where family bonds were meant to be sacred, one grandmother believed she had raised her grandson with love, guidance, and discipline. But what happens when trust turns into betrayal so horrific that it shocks even the most hardened hearts? This is the chilling story of an elderly woman's love, her desperate attempt to protect herself, and a grandson's descent into unthinkable violence. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where you're safe, where loyalty runs deep, and where love outweighs anger. But in this case, love wasn't enough to save 80-year-old Margaret Turner. Her 19-year-old grandson, Jason Miller, twisted by dark impulses and fear of exposure, violated the woman who had raised him since childhood. What began as a disgusting act of betrayal turned into cold-blooded murder when Margaret threatened to call the police. Tonight, we'll journey through their lives, the warning signs, the unimaginable crime, the investigation, and the courtroom reckoning that followed. It's a story that proves evil can sometimes come from the very people you trust most. Before we unravel this heart-wrenching story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into real crime cases that explore not just the crime itself, but the human emotions, betrayals, and choices that lead to tragedy. Now, let's begin. The streets of Boston have seen generations of families grow, thrive, and struggle. Among them was the Turner family, a name not known for wealth or prestige, but for resilience and quiet strength. At the heart of this family stood Margaret Turner, an 80-year-old woman who had lived through decades of change, war, and hardship, yet still carried a smile that could soften the roughest edges of life. Margaret was born in the 1940s, when the world seemed bigger, harsher, and survival was not promised. From a young age, she learned the importance of responsibility. She worked as a seamstress in her teens, married young, and built her world brick by brick alongside her husband, Richard Turner. Their marriage lasted almost 40 years, until a sudden heart attack took Richard away, leaving Margaret widowed and alone in her 60s. But Margaret was not the kind of woman who let grief defeat her. She poured her energy into her only daughter, Angela, and later into her grandson, Jason Miller, a boy who became both her pride and her burden. Angela, Margaret's daughter, had struggled with motherhood. She was restless, impulsive, and troubled with choices that often put her in harm's way. At just 21, she left Jason in Margaret's care, claiming she needed to find herself. Those who knew Angela doubted she would ever return. Margaret took the responsibility without hesitation. She was in her late 50s then, her joints aching, her hands calloused, but her heart determined. She became mother and father to Jason. She cooked his meals, walked him to school, sewed his torn clothes, and made sure every Christmas had at least one gift under the tree, even if it meant sacrificing her own needs. Neighbors admired her dedication. They often saw Margaret waiting outside her modest brick home on Maplewood Street, waving to Jason as he rode his bicycle down the block. She had a presence about her, a warmth that reminded people of simpler times. Yet, behind her loving smile was quiet exhaustion. Raising a child in old age is never easy. The world changes faster than older generations can adapt, and Margaret struggled to keep Jason grounded. Still, she believed in him. She believed love could shape him into a man of character. Jason Miller grew up with all the opportunities Margaret could provide, though life wasn't luxurious. He was a curious child, wide-eyed, and playful. Margaret proudly told neighbors how smart he was, how he could memorize entire passages from storybooks. But as Jason grew into adolescence, his personality began to shift. He was restless, often skipping school, hanging around older boys who whispered promises of excitement, late-night parties, easy money, and reckless freedom. Margaret, now in her 70s, tried to keep up. She grounded him when he broke curfew, scolded him for disrespect, and pleaded with him to stay on the right path. The arguments between them grew louder as Jason grew taller. At 17, he towered over her fragile frame, his once boyish face now hardening with arrogance. He resented the rules, resented the constant lectures, and sometimes, even resented her love. To outsiders, Jason was just another troubled teen. But to Margaret, he was still her boy, the child she had held in her arms, the boy who once clung to her skirts at the grocery store. She clung to that image, blind to how quickly it was fading. Despite the tension, moments of tenderness remained. Margaret still cooked his favorite meals, chicken stew, mashed potatoes, apple pie. She washed his clothes and left them neatly folded on his bed, even when he forgot to say thank you. She prayed for him nightly, asking God to watch over her grandson and guide his heart back to goodness. Jason, though distant, relied on her more than he admitted. Without her roof, he would have been homeless. Without her meals, he would have gone hungry. Deep down, he knew her love was his safety net, even if he never showed gratitude. But something darker was brewing inside Jason. His friends noticed his temper, his odd comments about women, his obsession with dominance and control. At home, Margaret noticed his lingering stares, his unpredictable mood swings. She chalked it up to youth and poor choices, never imagining it could spiral into something sinister. By 19, Jason had dropped out of high school. He spent most of his days on the couch, scrolling on his phone, and his nights roaming the streets. Margaret begged him to apply for jobs, to consider returning to school, to think about his future. But Jason laughed off her concerns. Still, Margaret never gave up. In the eyes of neighbors, she remained the picture of unconditional love. "He's a good boy deep down," she often told Mrs. Daniels, the woman who lived next door. "He just needs guidance. He'll come around." But Margaret's optimism blinded her to the danger that lurked within her home. The boy she raised, the boy she sacrificed everything for, was no longer the child she remembered. Jason's gaze had changed. His respect had withered. And somewhere in the shadows of their fragile relationship, the seed of betrayal had already been. This was the portrait of a grandmother who loved too deeply, and a grandson whose path veered into darkness. Margaret Turner could not have known that the sacrifices she made, the love she poured out like water, and the years she gave to raising Jason would one day become the very foundation of her undoing. Her story began with love and sacrifice. But soon, it would descend into horror. The July air in Boston was thick and heavy, pressing against the walls of Margaret Turner's small brick home on Maplewood Street. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted with bruised shades of purple and orange before darkness finally swallowed the neighborhood. Inside the house, the hum of an old ceiling fan did its best to stir the stagnant air, but the heat clung stubbornly to every corner. Margaret moved slowly through the kitchen, her back slightly hunched, her step steady but fragile. At 80, her body bore the weight of years, yet her spirit carried the same determination that had kept her family together for decades. Tonight, she had prepared Jason's favorite, baked chicken with rosemary potatoes. She hummed softly to herself as she arranged the plates, a tune from a hymn she had sung countless times in church. Jason entered the kitchen, his footsteps heavy, his shoulders slouched. At 19, he was restless energy contained in a young man's body. His dark hair fell into his eyes, his jaw tense, his face unreadable. He sat at the table without a word, scrolling through his phone, the blue glow casting sharp shadows across his features. Margaret placed the food in front of him with a small smile. "Eat, Jason. You've barely touched a proper meal all week," she urged gently. Jason muttered a half-hearted thanks but didn't look up. He ate mechanically, shoveling the food into his mouth while his eyes remained fixed on the screen. Margaret sat across from him, watching with quiet sadness. This wasn't the boy she remembered, the one who used to tell her every detail of his day at school, who used to ask for second helpings of pie with laughter in his eyes. That boy was gone, replaced by a young man who carried shadows she couldn't quite name. Dinner passed in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks against plates. Jason's movements were tense, almost agitated. Margaret noticed how he kept glancing at her, his eyes darting up and down as though studying her. She brushed it off as discomfort, perhaps frustration with her constant reminders about jobs and responsibilities. After finishing his meal, Jason stood abruptly, chair legs screeching against the tiled floor. He mumbled something indistinct and walked down the hall. Margaret sighed, gathering the dishes with her tired hands. She washed each plate slowly, her mind heavy with worry. It wasn't unusual for Jason to be distant, he had been that way for years. But tonight, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, almost charged, as though the house itself held its breath. Margaret shook off the feeling. She was old, tired, and perhaps too quick to imagine. By 10 o'clock, Margaret prepared for bed. She slipped into her cotton nightgown, combed her thinning gray hair, and whispered a short prayer beside her bed. She prayed for Jason, as always. She prayed that God would touch his heart, steer him away from the wrong influences, and remind him of the love he had been given. She didn't know these would be her final prayers. In the living room, Jason sat on the couch, phone forgotten. His mind was restless, disturbed. Thoughts churned violently inside him, resentment, anger, desire, fear. He stared down the hallway toward Margaret's bedroom, his jaw tightening. Jason's perception of his grandmother had twisted over time. She was no longer just the woman who raised him, no longer just the caregiver who fed him. In his mind, distorted by rage and lack of conscience, she had become an obstacle, a reminder of control, rules, and expectations he despised. And yet, beneath that resentment, there lurked darker impulses Jason had never spoken of but which grew unchecked in the silence of his troubled mind. He stood, his movements deliberate. The house was silent except for the faint creak of floorboards under his weight. Slowly, he made his way toward Margaret's room. Margaret had just pulled the covers over herself when she heard the door creak open. She looked up, expecting perhaps that Jason had come to say goodnight or to ask for money, as he sometimes did. But the look in his eyes was something she had never seen before. "Jason," she said softly, her voice tinged with both surprise and concern. He didn't answer. He stepped into the room, his broad frame casting a shadow across the floor. Margaret's heart quickened. She sat up slightly, gripping the blanket tighter around her frail body. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, trying to keep her tone calm. Jason's silence was suffocating. His eyes were fixed on her, cold and unsettling. In that moment, Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine, not from the summer heat, but from instinct. Something was terribly wrong. And then it happened. Jason lunged forward, his strength overwhelming against her frailty. Margaret gasped, struggling beneath him, her voice breaking into cries that were muffled by his hand. Her body shook with fear, her heart pounding as she realized the unthinkable, her own grandson was violating her. She begged him to stop, her words trembling through sobs. But Jason was deaf to her pleas, consumed by the monstrous act. When it was over, Margaret lay trembling, her face wet with tears. She pulled herself up with what strength she had left and stared at Jason with a mix of horror and defiance. You've ruined everything," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I will not let you get away with this. I'll call the police. You'll answer for what you've done." Her words cut through the room like a knife. Jason's face twisted, not with remorse, but with panic and rage. His breathing quickened, his fists clenching. The thought of prison, of his crime being exposed, filled him with a fear more powerful than guilt. Margaret turned toward the phone on her nightstand. Her hand reached out, trembling but determined. In that instant, Jason snapped. He grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, its cord dragging behind him like a serpent. Without hesitation, he brought it down across Margaret's head. The blow landed with a sickening thud. She cried out, collapsing onto the bed. Jason's breath grew ragged, his vision clouded with fury. He struck again. And again. Each swing silenced her cries a little more, until finally, the room fell into a chilling stillness. Margaret's body lay motionless, blood staining the sheets, the lamp bent and broken beside her. Jason staggered back, chest heaving. His hands trembled as he looked down at the lifeless form of the only person who had ever truly cared for him. Yet there was no grief in his eyes, only a cold, dawning realization of what he had done. The house was silent now, unnervingly so. The hum of the ceiling fan continued, indifferent to the horror that had unfolded beneath it. Jason stood in the darkness, sweat dripping down his brow, his pulse thundering in his ears. Margaret Turner, the grandmother who had sacrificed her twilight years to raise him, was gone. And it was by his own hands. The night of horror was complete. But Jason's nightmare was only just beginning. The lamp lay on the floor, its shade dented, its bulb shattered, wires coiling like veins across the carpet. Blood had splattered in arcs across Margaret's bedsheets, staining the delicate floral pattern she had cherished for years. Her small frame lay twisted, unmoving, one hand outstretched toward the phone she never managed to grasp. Jason Miller stood over her, chest heaving, hands trembling. The heat of the July night clung to his skin, yet he shivered as though caught in a winter storm. His breath came shallow, uneven, echoing unnaturally loud in the silence of the room. For a brief moment, he stared at his grandmother's body. The reality of what he had done pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. But instead of remorse, a darker instinct rose inside him: survival. Jason stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the cord of the broken lamp. He pressed both hands against his head, fingers tugging at his hair, eyes darting wildly around the room. What have I done? The thought screamed in his mind, but it wasn't born of guilt, it was fear. Fear of being caught. Fear of the police. Fear of spending his life in a cell. He whispered aloud, his voice quivering. Think, you have to fix this. His gaze shifted to the bed, the sheets soaked with blood. Then to the carpet, where droplets had already begun to seep deep into the fibers. He rushed forward, yanking the blanket from the bed, as though covering her body would erase what had happened. He dragged the fabric across the carpet, smearing the blood further instead of cleaning it. The coppery scent filled the air, making him gag. Jason ran to the bathroom, pulling out towels, wetting them under the faucet, and scrubbing furiously at the stains. His movements were clumsy, frantic. The harder he tried to erase the blood, the more it spread, darkening into larger stains that mocked his efforts. Sweat dripped from his forehead, stinging his eyes. His hands shook so violently that the wet towel slipped from his grip. He cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the sink. Margaret's presence lingered in every corner of the room, her perfume clung faintly to the air, her reading glasses sat neatly on the nightstand, her Bible lay open to Psalms. Jason's gaze lingered on it for a split second before he looked away, almost angrily, as though the words on the page accused him. His own clothing was stained. Spots of blood dotted his shirt, smeared across his forearms. He stripped quickly, balling the garments up and shoving them into a laundry basket. His mind raced with ideas: wash them, burn them, throw them in the dumpster down the street. Nothing seemed safe enough. He paced back and forth, his bare chest glistening with sweat, his breath sharp. Every creak of the house made him jump. He was convinced someone had heard. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked faintly in the distance. Somewhere, a car engine revved before fading into silence again. The ordinary sounds of suburban life continued, while inside this small house, horror lingered. Jason rushed to the windows, throwing them open to let in the night air. The breeze did little to clear the smell, the sharp, metallic tang of blood mixed with the mustiness of old linens. It was a smell he couldn't escape. It clung to him, burrowed into his skin, filled his nose until he thought he would choke. He lit a candle from the living room, setting it on the dresser as though a sweet scent could mask the stench of death. But the wax burned faintly, its fragrance powerless against the thick air. Jason's eyes fell back on Margaret's form beneath the blanket. He couldn't leave her there, not if he wanted to hide what he'd done. But the thought of moving her made his stomach churn. He approached cautiously, pulling the blanket tighter around her small body. She felt lighter than he expected, her frailty magnified in death. He dragged her off the bed and onto the floor, the sound of her body hitting the hardwood sending a jolt of dread through him. He thought of dragging her to the basement, of burying her beneath the floorboards, of carrying her out into the yard under cover of darkness. But each idea seemed impossible. He was only 19, inexperienced, panicked. The reality of hiding a body was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. And so, for hours, he stalled. He paced. He cleaned. He cursed. He froze. He did everything except face the truth that her body still lay in plain sight. At around 9:30 that night, as Jason dragged the bloodied blanket into the laundry room, the faint sound of movement carried through the thin walls of the house. Mrs. Daniels, the elderly neighbor next door, paused in her chair by the window. She had heard something earlier, a muffled cry, a dull thud, but she had told herself not to meddle. Margaret was tough, she thought. Perhaps she had dropped something. But now, as the house next door remained lit deep into the night, with shadows moving strangely across the windows. Mrs. Daniels frowned. Jason, unaware of her watchful eyes, continued his frantic motions. By midnight, exhaustion overtook him. The house was in disarray. Towels, blankets, and cleaning supplies were strewn across the floor. The air reeked of blood and sweat. Jason collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. His mind swirled with paranoia. Would anyone come looking? Would the neighbors suspect? How long before someone noticed Margaret's absence? The clock ticked mercilessly, each second dragging him closer to exposure. Jason's final thought before drifting into a shallow, restless sleep was not of his grandmother, not of the horror of what he had done, but of himself. I can't let them catch me. The cover-up was sloppy, doomed from the start. In his desperation, Jason left behind stains, fingerprints, and evidence that would tell the story he was trying so hard to erase. Forensics would later piece it together with ease. But in that moment, alone in the house, the night pressing against the windows, Jason believed he still had a chance. He believed that if he just cleaned enough, just stayed quiet enough, he could bury the truth. What he didn't know was that the truth was already seeping out, through the walls, through the silence, and into the watchful eyes of the community that had loved Margaret Turner. When Margaret didn't attend Sunday church, concern spread quickly. She was reliable, never missed a service. A church friend called her home, but there was no answer. Eventually, a welfare check was requested. Police arrived and found the door unlocked. Inside, the living room was in disarray. In Margaret's bedroom, they discovered her battered body. The sight told a story no one wanted to believe. She had not died peacefully. Jason was nowhere to be found. Detectives began piecing the puzzle together. They noticed blood-stained clothing in the laundry basket and found Jason's fingerprints on the lamp. The autopsy revealed signs of sexual assault before death. The community was shaken to its core. The idea that Jason, a young man everyone saw Margaret care for like her own, could be responsible, horrified neighbors. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Within 48 hours, Jason was found hiding at a friend's apartment. He showed no remorse during questioning. Instead, he muttered excuses. She was going to ruin my life. I didn't mean to. The trial became a nightmare replay of the events. Prosecutors painted Jason as manipulative, violent, and utterly remorseless. Defense attorneys attempted to argue his troubled upbringing and claimed he acted out of fear of abandonment. But the jury saw through the smokescreen. Key testimony came from forensic experts, neighbors who heard cries, and Jason's own taped confession. Margaret's church community filled the courtroom each day, wearing pins with her picture and whispering prayers for justice. After weeks of testimony, the verdict was read. Jason Miller, guilty of rape and first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Though Margaret's life ended in tragedy, her memory lived on in the community. Her church held vigils. Neighbors planted flowers in her honor. The tragedy became a cautionary tale. Love and sacrifice are not always enough to change someone determined to follow a dark path. Jason's name became a reminder of betrayal, but Margaret's became a symbol of love. Even in her final moments, she stood up for herself, refusing to let Jason's crime be hidden. This case is more than a brutal crime, it's a story of broken trust, twisted impulses, and the courage of an elderly woman who refused to be silenced. Jason Miller sits behind prison bars, convicted for the rape and murder of the very woman who raised him. Justice, though bittersweet, was served. But nothing can replace Margaret Turner's life. Her legacy is a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't come from strangers in the night, but from those closest to us. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? Do you believe Jason's crime was born purely of evil, or do you think his troubled life played a role in shaping his monstrous actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We bring you not just the crimes, but the human stories behind them, stories of betrayal, justice, and the lessons we can never forget. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, trust is precious, never take it for granted.